I'm Davin Hutchins with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, our second installment of 2 radio podcast programs devoted to looking back on the momentous events of 2011 and the rise of the Arab Spring and what's ahead in 2012. It's all ahead on Voice of America. Once again, we're going to break with our format a little today, what you usually hear on Middle East Monitor. Instead of looking at the top stories, this week we're going to be spending the next half hour looking back at the momentous events of the Arab Spring. From Tunisia to Egypt to Syria, few of us, and I'm sure few of you, could have anticipated what would have happened in the Arab world just a year ago. For dictators, either abdicated or thrown out, free parliamentary elections taking place across North Africa, and entrenched revolutions that may turn the Arab Spring into a frigid winter in some countries. Today's show, we're going to be looking at Libya, Yemen, and Syria. Now, I'm joined here in the studio, in Studio 38, by senior reporters Cecily Hilleary and David Arnold. And also joining us is Scott Bobb from Jerusalem, who's our correspondent and covered the war in Libya firsthand. A little later, we'll also be joined by online editor Jurij Hiltajczuk. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's talk firstly about Libya. Now, this was unique and different than the other Arab revolutions that we've talked about so far in a couple of different ways. Number one, it went from revolution to civil war quite quickly. Part of the reason was the extreme backlash that Gaddafi had, calling his own people rats, and basically making it clear that he would not surrender under any circumstance. Early on, by February 27th, the National Transitional Council was formed, which actually created a body from which the opposition could articulate their expectations, but also a rebellion started in the eastern part of the country. Now, Scott, you went into Libya. Tell us your impressions of the Libyan Arab Spring and how it differed from the other countries.
Well, Davin, it was different, as they all have been, in that there was this uprising that succeeded and in controlling a part of the country very early. They almost lost it, which led to the NATO airstrikes, which is also another unique feature. But what is similar is that it started with people who were just fed up. It was a surprise in the sense that it's happening, but it was not a surprise in that many people had been feeling this resentment for years and even decades, and it was just what was surprising that it's happening. We had the examples of Tunisia and of Egypt, and then when one thought that Algeria might be the next to go, but when it happened in Libya, it was a bit of a surprise. And then there was this tipping point, and that I find it to be a common thread, where at one point the regime in power had utilized its forces to kill its own people to such an extent that the people revolted and said, okay, we're prepared to die rather than endure this any longer. And we've seen that, I think, in just about all of these countries.
Now, Gaddafi, of course, was a unique dictator, famous, extremely eccentric, had clashed with the West, of the United States in particular, in the 80s, and was kind of went through a reform in the last 5 or 6 years in terms of warming to the West, but clearly someone who was a strange ruler and hated by his subjects. Do you feel that the fact that Gaddafi was the target here, and Gaddafi made these somewhat incomprehensible statements during those final months, is part of the reason why things turned out the way they did in the end? And this is to all of you.
Gaddafi ruled on whimsy. He also put his family in power. As his children got older, they became a clan rule, which was different from, say, the Ba'athist regimes in Syria and Iraq, which are highly organized, institutionalized systems. As a result, it collapsed more easily because there just wasn't that institution. Gaddafi systematically destroyed institutions of power, including the religious ones. And so what's the problem now is that with these institutions destroyed, the challenge is building new ones up so that you have a viable state.
Also, want to mention there are parallels between what happened in Libya and what's happening in Syria now, except on 2 levels. On one hand, Assad definitely has made overtures in terms of reforms or changing things like the emergency law, where Gaddafi never really made any overture to his people that he was going to cede anything. And the second, as you mentioned, Scott, is the international coalition mobilized quite quickly. Question to you and to the rest of our panel is, why do you think there was that resolve in the international community when we really haven't seen, and maybe not likely to see, that kind of intervention or at least cooperation in some of the other countries. Why Libya? Why is it different?
Well, I can say from a personal level, I arrived in Benghazi right after, it was about 3 weeks after the uprising when the pro-Gaddafi forces nearly took the city. And there's evidence that they had instructions to destroy it, to rape, pillage, do whatever they wanted. And there was this risk of an all-out mass slaughter, which has been seen in parts of the Arab world, in the 80s especially. And so this, led by France in this case, was why there was not only the resolve, but almost the haste to set up this, because Benghazi nearly fell about 3 weeks into the uprising, and it would have been something of a holocaust.
But there's a difference, too. With Syria, it just has to do with, I think, geography. There's so much more of a concern that any kind of intervention will have repercussions throughout the region. I think Libya, just by its location alone, and also, let's be honest here, oil, that played a huge role. A lot of oil companies were in there and couldn't afford to see the country collapse.
Now, we shouldn't leave. We're talking about basically Arab Spring countries that haven't had a quick resolution and have dragged on. We can't leave Yemen out of this, of course, because Yemen probably would have ended up quite differently if there wasn't an assassination attempt on Ali Abdullah Saleh's life. I mean, it could have looked more like Libya or maybe even more like Syria. David, you were covering Yemen in your coverage. What do you feel were the unique components of the Yemeni revolution, and do you think it's over?
No, it's not over. It's it may unfortunately have just begun, because the youth who went into the square, into Change Square in this case, they're still there, and they have a spokeswoman by the name of Tawakkol Karman, who's going to be globally famous, and she has said in Arabic when she accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, "We're going to continue." And if you look at the other side, the government that is now there is half Saleh supporters and half the old political elite who wanted to remove him so they could be in. So we may have an election in February, but it looks very much like it'll be the same kind of government.
I think a lot of what you're seeing in Arab Spring countries, Yemen also, is the revolution is an ongoing thing. And when you're talking about a revolution, you're talking about, yes, overthrowing your dictator is really your first step. Because a lot of the people in these countries haven't had the political experience that Western democracies have, that seems like, hey, remove that guy, it's fixed. And in most of these countries, whether it's elections, runoff, Islamists coming to power, really the complexities just start happening once you remove that person. That's just the first phase. And even on the coverage now, I think we're hearing time and time again, no, the revolution is still ongoing. I mean, the Egyptians have told us this. Syrians certainly, Yemenis have told us this. But in addition, it means something different to them. And they don't know if it means elections or they don't know if it means becoming politically aware, getting involved in their communities. But the thing is like, what is this definition of the Arab Spring? Most people think it's a revolution. But it's something more than that. It's going to be something ongoing that will last, as we're here on our annual, retrospective, more than a year, more than a season. This is an ongoing thing.
One thing that I've heard over and over again is that power completely shifted from leaders to the populace in the Arab Spring. In talking with a fellow VOA reporter on Tunisia a couple of days ago, she said simply, if the Islamic Party doesn't do well in Tunisia, well, we'll just take to the streets and get rid of them. So things, the whole balance has shifted for, I think, many, many years to come.
I think in terms of Yemen and Sana'a and Taiz, where there were even heavier losses during the protests, the youth who started all of this, they talk about they don't say we're going to be running in the election in February. They say we're going to watch these elections. I think they have grown up. They may have been naive in the beginning, but they have learned that they have a lot to learn about how to politically organize.
Now, of course, we're all going to turn to Syria, an Arab Spring revolution that began early. I, for one, didn't think that much would come of that. The demands were as legitimate as the rest of them, but it really didn't ignite the same way that the others did. It sort of started Nothing happened for a while, and then suddenly, really in the early summer of this year, is when we started seeing critical mass take place. Really, it started, I wasn't aware of this, but in January 26th, Hassan Ali Akale poured gasoline on himself in the same way that Bouazizi did in Tunisia. Didn't have exactly the same effect. Most of the protests centered around Daraa in March. But it was really after Daraa, and then the response, the military response by deploying tanks and soldiers in places like Homs, Banias, Damascus, and Latakia, is when really the revolution as we know it now started to grow. And it's still very much unresolved. Syria is marked by the fact that it is dragging on, the fact that there seems to be a certain recalcitrance by Bashar al-Assad in terms of conceding any power, but the UN Security Council and NATO, they're not taking the same approach that they've taken with Libya, because there are different national interests presumably there. But the humanitarian crisis seems to grow. Hopefully it won't be as something as severe as what happened in Libya, but there really doesn't seem to be any sign of immediate resolution. Cecily, you've been covering Syria quite a bit. I mean, what is your sense of what makes this? People are saying Syria's turning from an Arab Spring to a winter.
Yeah, well, I think from the beginning, Bashar al-Assad had plenty of time to plan this. Let's not forget that this isn't the first revolution that Syria has faced, and under his father Hafez, they put down a revolution, based in Homs to the tune of 30,000 people. This is a regime that has had experience in the past. And I think just by the time, this wave of protests reached, he'd already planned pretty much his offensive, should people rise up. That's one point. And of course, he was very confident, of his standing with good reason. The international community has been very reluctant. They were very slow to criticize him for fear of what would happen next.
Now, foreign journalists have not been permitted to operate freely inside the country. Some have been doing it clandestinely.
Yes.
One of the people who've gotten closest is Scott Bobb, who's here with us. Now, Scott, you went to some of the border areas and talked to refugees there. What is your sense of the humanitarian issues and how they're growing?
I was there in July and August, and the first thing that struck me was the resolve of the people I spoke to, defectors and civilians who had fled, the resolve to maintain the uprising and to succeed in it. They had had enough of the abuses and the oppression, and they said, we're prepared to die. This is where it's so similar to some of the others. The second aspect of it all was that they wanted it to be peaceful. Unlike Libya, which very quickly turned into a civil war of sorts, this, at least initially, and even the military defectors said, no, we're actually supervising and overseeing and making sure that there are no abuses, violence, and use of arms against the authorities. We want this to be a peaceful uprising, and this is very strong. This may be changing now, and then to add one thing, just a comment to Syria, it's that the one thing that struck me about this is that in Syria, as in Iraq, you had a Praetorian Guard that was in charge. The military there was so disciplined and well trained and dedicated that, as in Iraq, it's very difficult for a popular uprising to succeed, unlike some of these other countries.
Also, we should mention, because there is no access, really first-hand access in Syria, which is unlike the case in Egypt, is unlike the case in Libya, as we've covered. We have to rely more upon social media and using devices like Twitter, Facebook, Skype. I mean, a lot of our reporting is trying to get a sense of what's going on there. And this isn't just us. I mean, the Associated Press, when they have video from Syria, is usually coming from some of these online news agencies. And the images have been horrific. I mean, every day you can go through and see people who have been bludgeoned in the head, kids who have been tortured or purportedly tortured, and it seems to be just a torrent of information as citizens themselves are trying to document things that normal cameras wouldn't capture. And it's interesting now that the authorities don't want these things captured, but there's really no way to contain social media or to contain these things. If they're happening, at some point they'll probably be unearthed.
Well, I met some of the bloggers, the civic activists in northern Lebanon and in Beirut, and one of the things that was very curious is the technology. When the Syrian government shut down SMS and cell phones and internet, they found a portal that was still being used probably by government and its collaborators, and they were using that to communicate with the outside world even when most of the access had been cut off. And so it's this high-tech knowledge and use of it that I think is also a factor.
Also, I want to bring in our online editor, Jurij Hiltajczuk, who's been talking with people both who support the Assad regime and then people who want the removal of the Assad regime on social media. Jurij, can you actually talk about, we did a story over the summer about people who support Assad, and also we had a debate that came out of that, basically people rationalizing why they support. Can you kind of summarize their perspective?
Syria presented a very unique case for us because it is such a closed environment and so inaccessible to us as journalists. So it was interesting to see how the conversation evolved in the social media platforms. And we, on the one hand, we had what is being perceived by journalists and others around the world as this kind of overwhelming evidence of atrocities being committed. I should mention that I'm referring to the video evidence that is circulating.
There's something I'd like to say that I have found as a problem throughout the Arab Spring. That is, and I've said this many times, we can only report on what we hear and what people tell us. In the case of Bahrain and again in Syria, many pro-regime people on Twitter have accused us of being biased. We have said repeatedly and trying to reach out to the government for their side of the story. It's very difficult. And I think this Arab Spring has been really challenging for us on that note. I will say this, I've been very impressed with the dialogue on social media with people of the pro-Assad tweets and Facebook followers. I have not found anybody trying to smear anybody or personally attack, which has not necessarily been the case with Bahrain, I'm sorry to say. And people are genuinely interested in dialogue. So it's a positive thing.
Well, we only have a little bit of time left, and we've looked back at this incredible 2011 of the Arab Spring, which is analogous perhaps to Eastern Europe in 1989 and 1990. And as we've already said, much of it's still unresolved. Revolutions that have overthrown their dictators are now facing elections where it looks like moderate Islamists or conservative Islamists might have more political power than they had in the past, and everyone must deal with their perspective. Maybe they'll become entrenched, or maybe they'll become even more moderate through the democratic process. No one can really say what will happen. We have a humanitarian crisis in Syria that shows no sign of resolution, and we're going into 2012 and probably the beginning of 2012 covering this story. Yemen, people feel cheated. Maybe the revolution was hijacked because a lot of the same people who worked for Saleh are going to be sort of in charge of determining the rules of what happens next. So I'm just curious, what do you think you've learned in 2011 covering this series of stories, and what do you think really in 2012 we're going to be dealing with, and how different will it be from what we just have done?
I have to admit that I can't tell you what I've learned. I'm still learning.
On one hand, I've been so encouraged because, without the intervention of outside powers, so many people in countries that I've spent a lot of time in are showing real democratic aspirations, a real yearning, and a real education about how democracy and the international community should work. I think the thing that complicates matters is we've seen it's not like they all end up in the same place. Hey, we get rid of our dictator and we have these great elections. Everybody wants that. But as you mentioned, David, every country has different GDP, they have different natural resources, they have different cultural, sectarian, and because of all of these things compounding together, you're getting very, very different results.
Yeah, we all looked at the Arab Spring in the beginning. Oh boy, democracy is going to prevail. in countries where governments have fallen and democracies are in the process of being established, there is a whole lot of cleanup to be done. We're talking about countries that have, in some cases, been under dictators for 40 years. How do you proceed with democracy when a dictatorship is all you know? Infrastructures are destroyed, tourist industries. This is a very small moment in the big scheme of history, but to the people on the ground, it's going to seem eternal, I think, as they clean up.
And I think there's a tendency, I think, in the West when you look at these areas like, democracies need to have a Western flavor. You have a strong executive, you have two branches of a legislature, you have strong courts. Those are elements, but there's also, I think, the Arab world may define a different type of democracy. A lot of people talk about Turkey.
Yes.
Turkey started secular, but you really have a pro-business, pro-EU, but very socially conservative Muslim party there. And a lot of people are saying that Turkey, I can't think of any country that has taken its particular take on democracy the way Turkey has done. And a lot of countries are saying Turkey is one model to look at, where you have Islamic principles coincide with a modern state. And there are certainly complications to that. There are complications with Turkey in terms of authoritarianism and jailing journalists and things of this nature. But I think what you can say is it functions. There hasn't been the military intervening like it had done in decades past, and that is one sign. But and the other thing I wanted to mention is, there's still, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, there's still areas where they're very strong monarchies, they're very entrenched, the people are relatively well off and perhaps not as eager to revolt, but there's still minorities in those countries are hungering for rights as well. And I think, I'm curious to see if 2012 means we actually see reform from monarchies, or there's some sort of constitutional monarchy or democratic monarchy that may emerge, or at least maybe more reform, or maybe it'll be more of the same, and maybe you'll have what you have in the Gulf now for another 10 years. I don't know.
And this is a perfect time in history for those people who've been calling for reform of Islam. As we've seen religious parties who've been banned for so long coming to power, and populations nervous about this, this is a perfect time to open up dialogue for a new understanding of Islam, its role in these countries and with the world.
Well, there's a lot of fear on political Islam. I think Egypt is a telling case because you have the Muslim Brotherhood's party and you have the Anur party. The Anur is more conservative, more Salafist, but they disagree on almost just about everything, other than, the Quran and Islam should have a stronger role in guiding the country. But they weren't even part of the same political coalition going into these elections. So there are degrees of political Islam. And, in the Muslim Brotherhood's case, they've been at this and running unofficially in Parliament for a long time. They've also been moderated over time and trying to make a difference within the political system that they did have, and, of course, the political system that they have now.
I'm interested asking you, Hutch, do you think Egypt could follow the Turkish model?
Well, I've only been to Turkey a couple times. I've lived in Egypt. They're very different. Keep in mind, Ataturk in Turkey, he was insisted upon secularism, and that was really the credo, the religion.
To an extreme, yeah.
Yeah, they were reacting to whatever was left of the Ottoman Empire. When I was in Egypt, it seemed conservative, or elements of it seemed conservative. But I think Egypt can also find its own democratic voice and potential, because on one hand you still have tremendous poverty, you still have an uneven economic growth where you have a lot of haves and a very small middle class have done very well under Mubarak. You have far more people who have to deal with unemployment around 30%. I think the question is if the election changes things where the military takes more of a back seat, you might have a strong president in Egypt, like you do in Turkey. Then you might have more stability, but that still has to come to economic stability in order for those benefits to trickle down to these other people. In all of these countries, really, unemployment, illiteracy, being excluded from the political system is really the common thing that was the bedrock for all of these things happening. And unless those are addressed in these new democracies, you could see this all happen again.
You're right.
We're going to have to leave it there. On a personal note, I just want to tell the whole team that I really enjoyed working with everyone this year. in covering the Arab Spring and watching everybody grow as journalists. I hope to do the same in 2012. This has been VOA's Middle East Monitor. International Edition is next. Thank you for tuning in.